Welcome to Winners, Wallets, and Worldviews, the only show that's going to teach you
how to be somebody.
Where in your life did you learn that you're not good enough?
Take what you're most passionate about and what you're most fearful of. What is the plan to overcome that fear? And what is the plan to enact that passion?
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Winners, Wallets, and Worldviews. I'm your host, AJ Armstrong. You can always follow me on Instagram at AaronArmstrong33, or you can go to my website, AaronJArmstrong.com. Winners, Wallets, Worldviews is a podcast geared towards business leaders and thought pioneers. We talk about winners, people crushing it in life, the different kinds of success they might have in different aspects. Talk about personal finance, entrepreneurship, business. And finally, we look at the underlying philosophies that guide a lot of these different people. And one of them in particular to me is my Christian faith, but we bring in all different types of views and walks of life, and we decide to have intellectual conversations where we uncover truth. And today we have a very special guest where we're going to talk more on the worldview side, especially amid a lot of the political chaos we see today. And the question we want to answer is what can we do to connect in this divisive world? And this might not just be divisive in the form of race, but this could also be divisive in the form of policy and politics and all the different things right now that are being engineered to polarize us. What does it look like to be a good person, and where are some things we can go, and what's direction we can go? So my special guest we have today is Joe Arneson, who is a speaker, a thought leader, and the pastor with Community Church, and Community Church is New City. And this is going to be a very special treat for us today. So Pastor Joe, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, absolutely, AJ. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And we only have about 25 minutes here to crush through some really deep topics. So we just want to kind of get some people's gears turning.
All right, let's do it.
Get some thoughts going. But what I wanted to ask you first was, you kind of got a really interesting background. I want to just give you a really quick 30-second elevator pitch of kind of your background and experience a little bit, and then I'll dig into some questions for you.
Yeah, so I grew up in County, Wisconsin, a small little town outside of Oshkosh. My wife and I got married in 2010. We now have 3 kids, and I am pastor at the church that I started going to when I was in college. I started as the intern with the youth ministry. They decided they liked me and they kept me around. I just finished my master's 2 years ago. From Western Seminary, based in Portland, Oregon. Yay, food truck. And that's been super beneficial. And it's great. And so, man, the past 6 months, the key word has been flexibility and adaptability, because it's been an ever-changing world, man. And so, like, really figuring out how do we do church online? How do we do any of this stuff? And we bought my parents' house, the house that I grew up in, and so now we have a giant garden, we have bees, we have chickens, and it's a whole fun fiasco over here at the Aronson house. So yeah, it's good.
Hey Joe, Marissa's gonna be so jealous. She wants to live the farm life so bad. So we'll talk about that sometime. But we're gonna dig into some deep topics, and I think some interesting topics, especially when it's impossible to ignore it, the way the news is going, the way everything in the world is being presented. And I think what we're seeing, and this is my opinion, and I want to get your thoughts too, is we're seeing a lot of negative publicity because there's this distinction of good and evil. And I think what we're seeing is a lot of side effects to evil behavior. Things we wanted to talk about today was a little bit of the difference between what does it mean to be a good person and a bad person. And when Joe gets back on, I think he's going to have some really interesting topics on what that looks like. But when we look at the word good, oftentimes what that means is something worthy of praise, something really phenomenal. And this is my opinion, and we're going to get Joe here in a second. And I'm really curious to see what he has to say, because when you look at something that's worthy of praise, that's really, truly worth it. Hey, no worries, man. I was just kind of covering for you for a second as you hopped on, but let's jump back into the good stuff. What I think that begs the question is, what is good? What does it mean to be a good person? I think we all aspire to be a good person. I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are of what does it mean to be a good person?
The question becomes according to what or whom, in terms of what is moral and what is immoral. You look throughout history and there's all sorts of different answers to that. At times, I mean, 5,000 years ago, there are lots of different cultures in which child sacrifice is considered to be like totally acceptable and moral
Right.
and part of their like religious practice. There's even in the history of this country, there was a time where children were, I mean, they worked and like they went into mines like in 7, 8, 9 years old, and that was considered perfectly acceptable. But we would say now, like, no, that's not something that's acceptable. Children need to be in school, and there needs to be, you know, OSHA and all those types of things. And so the question really becomes according to what, or according to whom are we basing our view of good and bad as we think about it. And as we think about, so I'm a pastor, and my whole job is to help people follow Jesus. That's what I do. And so as we think about the Bible, the story in the Bible, it starts out with this story with these two people named Adam and Eve, and they eat this fruit that God says they're not supposed to eat. And it's not, and then the whole world spirals into chaos. But what they're really doing in that moment is not just eating a piece of fruit. What they're really saying is, we want to be like God. We want to decide what is good and what is evil from our own vantage point. And then the whole world spirals into chaos. And so I think one of the things we have to think about is okay, if we are going to be good people, we have to determine where we define those things.
Draw the line almost, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think
So-
you're you know, it's a big question for just a few minutes of an answer, and
Yeah.
and I think really what you're hitting on is this idea of relativism versus objective morality, and I think it's a big topic and an interesting topic. But as you said, you know,
Yep.
like our perception as a society of what good and bad has changed significantly over time. But there's, I think, what's unique about, in this case, in our discussion today, the Christian worldview is the standard of what we look at, and the objective standard of what good and evil is. And that's a big question and a great answer, which kind of pushes me into the next question here for a second. And it's what is unique about the Christian worldview into establishing what we call goodness or good behavior?
Yeah. Well, so much of what this country is, I hesitate to say that America is a Christian nation, because there's a big, huge conversation about that, right?
Yep.
But the thing that everybody agrees on is that we are at least very much informed by Judeo-Christian principles and values. Things like equality and justice and care, and those, even some of the rugged individualism has crept its way in there, but that's more European than Christian, I would say. But those ideas are they're there. They're there from, and so how we have created this country has. I mean, the people that developed the whole idea of the United States of America had a particular worldview. They had a way that they viewed the world, and that was very much informed by a lot of the biblical principles. And one of those things being that all people are created in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
So we go back to Genesis chapter 1 again, right before Adam and Eve screw everything up and it totally falls into chaos. God creates Adam and Eve, and he makes them in his image. It's kind of the way we think about it is the statue of the Lincoln Memorial, okay? When we look at the statue of the Lincoln Memorial, it's supposed to remind us of, boom,
Lincoln,
exactly. But it's not Lincoln, right? It's a stone mold of Lincoln. It doesn't move, it doesn't talk, but it reminds us and points us back toward Lincoln. In that same way, humans are created uniquely out of all the other creatures of the world to bear God's image, to point them back, to point all the rest of creation back to God and be his representatives in the world. And so we see this idea continue to be fleshed out throughout all of the scriptures, that all people have dignity and worth. And it's not just based on what you can do for me, that your worth is intrinsic to who you are, simply by being a person. It doesn't matter what you contribute to society. The fact that you are breathing is plenty. And even if you, and this is rubber and road stuff, even if you need a machine to help you breathe, you still have intrinsic value because you are, in fact, a human being. The book of Proverbs talks about, as in chapter 31 says, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. And it's so, man, like this is a from a biblical perspective, this is the call. Like this is what we are supposed to do, is care about people because God cares about people. And it's really kind of as simple as that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that it's being challenged a little bit out there. You know, we start to see what we're so easily pulled into things like anger. We're so easily pulled into these primal instincts of behavior. But I think it's the difficult part is the idea that we are all united as one image. We are equal. We have this intrinsic inherent worth. And I think that's the beautiful piece of what the Christian worldview and the Christian story really is. Yeah. So, I mean, when we're looking at this world that's so divisive, when you know, we've in the last week and a half, we've seen a lot of racial controversy. We've seen a lot of hate on both sides of this. You know, we've seen a lot of violence. We've seen a lot of things that I think it's really tearing us apart, and it's creating some level of division. Whether you like it or not, whether you agree with what's going on, and whatever side you pick, you have to admit everybody right now has a very polarizing opinion. Yep. And I think this is where it's interesting to get your opinion on, like, what did Jesus say about what would, like, you know, he didn't talk about this exact situation, right? But what did he say that could give us an idea of how we can handle this as people, as followers of Jesus?
Yeah. So it's so hard. And it's so hard because we are really good at justifying ourselves, and we're really good at deceiving ourselves. Like we never will stop and say, I'm probably the bad guy. Like we just don't do that. Even in the way that some of the latest media that's been put out, the ambiguity of good and evil, and you don't quite know who the good and evil people are. Says a lot how we're wrestling with this question. And the idea is that maybe there's not this good and evil, it's just different sides, and depends on how you look at it. And I think when you boil that down, it comes down like we are good at justifying ourselves and our own behaviors. And even if they are atrocious, we can figure out a way to do the mental gymnastics to say, no, this is actually acceptable, so that when your head hits the pillow, you don't say, man, I'm a total and complete monster. We see that some of this stuff with, when we look at the life of Jesus as recounted in the Gospels, he has a lot of, he has these conflicts with the people called the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They're religious leaders of the day. And their whole idea, one of the things they were really looking to do was to be holy. They were trying to do everything that God had asked them to do, literally to a T. And so one of the things they would do is they would build extraneous rules around some of these things so that they wouldn't even get close to it. And then what that inevitably evolved into is this person isn't holy, so I'm going to stay away from that person. And so what Jesus comes and does is he comes and he breaks down so many of those barriers. We see, and people get super pissed at him because of the people that he's interacting with. Like the woman at the well, in the middle of the day, this woman is going and she's getting water out of this well. He goes up and he has a conversation with her. Totally taboo in his culture, in his time, in his place. Totally unacceptable, crossed a lot of those different lines. The idea that he would interact with Gentiles, with non-Jews, who are considered to be unclean people. And if you interact with them, you become unclean. But Jesus was willing to go and do that. Even lepers. So you get leprosy and you have a skin disease. And the Jews thought that they were under some sort of curse from God. And so they were forced to live outside of the city walls so that the evil that they had done, whatever it was, wouldn't infest their city. And so Jesus would go and lepers would have to walk around and they would have to say, leper, and they would have to announce that, okay, this is who I am. and they hadn't, a lot of them, honestly, they hadn't been touched in decades. And Jesus comes in, he's willing to touch them. And man, there's something so powerful about person-person contact. Especially, we very much realized that over the past 9 weeks, haven't we?
I'd say.
You know, Zoom is great technology, but man, it's so much better to have a face-to-face conversation. And even one of the stories that Jesus tells, and this is a famous story, it's the story of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritans they're bad guys. From the eyes of a Jew, they're not the good guys. and they end up being the good guys in this story. They're the ones. The Samaritan's the one who helps this person and shows neighborly love to this person. And the good guys are actually the bad guys because they ignore the person who's in need of help. Jesus is so good at making the good guys and from bad guys and bad guys from good guys when he tells stories, and it's really, really powerful stuff, man.
Well, I think you bring up a lot of really interesting points to show the relevance that a lot of biblical stories have in today's time. I mean, you're talking about, very similar circumstances. People, this isn't new stuff that people organize themselves into factions, that they have very tribal behaviors, that that we really like to pit ourselves against one another. And I think one of the things that, you're showing here in a lot of these Bible stories too, is that this is part of our human nature. It's part of our fallen nature, is to really hate people based on their religious preferences, to hate people based on the color of their skin. And then some of these things happen. So tell me a little bit about how Jesus responds to hate. When you look at a lot of things that are going on, I think whether you like it or not, there's wrath going on that's motivating people one way or another. A lot of times it's difficult to separate your rage from your reason. And how does Jesus respond to that? I mean, I think in examples in Sermon on the Mount, when he goes in to reform the law, just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Jesus says some pretty outlandish types of things, you might even say. One of them being what you're talking about is love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And it's like, oh, that's such a great sentiment. This is
louder for the people in back.
Cool. but for real, love your enemies. And it's not to just have, good, warm feelings toward your enemies, but it's, the biblical authors expound upon that, where love is patient and kind. It's not envious or boastful. Those very proactive things, those decision type of things where this is what it means to love. You lay down your life for your friends is the greatest love, Jesus says. And so the idea of loving your enemy is, it doesn't make a lot of sense if we're really honest. You think about, okay, your political enemy, this very politically divisive time right now. If you're on one side of the aisle, you have enemies on the other side, and maybe they're frenemies, they're not people that you actually want to throw down with, but they're the people that you're oh, I'll throw down.
But they comment on your Facebook status and you get in debates. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But it's man, the call that Jesus says to the people who are going to follow him is that all of that needs to be sprinkled with love. And maybe even more than sprinkled, it needs to be motivated by love. As you're interacting with even the people who are your enemies, you need to love them. The call is to love them. Jesus tells a story about people who fed him or fed people and gave them something to drink and clothed them and visited them in prison. And then he says, all of those things that you did to me. And they're like, hold on here. What are you talking about? You weren't in prison. You weren't starving. We didn't give you any clothes, that's for sure. And he says, no, whatever you did to those, you actually did that to me. And then he points to these other people and he says, you saw me hungry. You didn't give me anything to eat. You saw me without food. You didn't give me anything to clothe myself. You didn't visit me in prison. And he says, depart from me into hellfire, really. And he says, because you didn't do those things to me. And so what Jesus is really talking to, and this is what makes the Christian worldview so pervasive and so it's so upside down in so many different ways, is that we're supposed to actually care about people. And man, Christians shoot themselves in the foot all the time with this.
Talk about that. Yeah.
All the time. You talk, well-intentioned. And we're, like I said, we're really easy to, it's really easy for us to justify ourselves. And people need to learn to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they're responsible for themselves. And no, what Jesus really says is when you actually get into what the scriptures say is, no, you're responsible for them. You're responsible for your brother. You're responsible for your sister. And your brother and your sister are the people who lock arms with you and follow me together. You don't just get to ask them by the wayside because they might be inconveniencing you. Or maybe they might even be costing you something. No, you're supposed to care for these people. And then when you do care for those people, you are in fact caring for Jesus himself. And man, that's put your mind diaper on when you think about that one. That's a wild one, you know.
Yeah,
It's pretty intense.
It's people. I don't think they might have grown up in the Christian faith, or they might have heard this before, but at that time, that was such a radical worldview to love your enemy as I have loved you, to love your enemy as you love yourself. You know, to love is the action here. It's not a feeling; it's an action. It's a thing you have to do. I think that's what's so unique about that. And to me, I don't see how that can't be a fantastic solution to the world today. I can't see how that won't work. If every single person just committed right now and said, listen, you can disagree with me. I feel rage in my body and in my bones, but I love you and I will continue to love you because we are all united. We are all made in the image of God. What if we all said that, Joe? What would happen?
Oh man, that's I have no idea. But it would be beautiful. It would be a beautiful thing. And it's I'm reminded of some of the war vets that you hear talk about. They have so much political difference with certain people, and I disagree with everything you stand for, but I will literally die for your right to say it. And I think there's something really, really powerful in that, in your willingness to, like, there is something we disagree. Okay, that's just is what it is. But we can still disagree and have some sort of unity in the midst of this. And just because I disagree with you does not mean that I hate you. There's something that's happened within our culture that we've our ideas and our philosophies have gotten so driven into who we are as a person, that if we disagree with somebody's ideas or philosophies, then somehow it's a rejection of them. And I think sometimes that's the case, but we have to be willing to have intellectual conversations at some point and talk about some of these things about what is moral, what is immoral. You can't ever be neutral, but in a way that is actually beneficial, and we don't necessarily take it personally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is it's okay to criticize an idea, but it's not necessarily okay to, criticize a person, for lack of a better word, or maybe, to hate a person. But it's okay an idea could be wrong. An idea can be wrong. And in fact, that's the definition of truth, is to say these ideas are just objectively wrong and incorrect, and these ideas are correct. I think it's okay to be able to discuss that, and be able to have that conversation by still caring about you, by still loving you, by still, feeling a connection towards you. And to me,
you think about like boxers or UFC fighters, they just go at it in the ring. And as soon as that bell rings, they're giving each other a big hug, covered in sweat and blood. And it's like, man, okay, we just went at it.
Right.
Okay. No, that was great. That was
it was for the belt.
Exactly. For real. And I think there's something to that.
Yeah. And I couldn't think of a more powerful way of saying this. And, just to reiterate to everybody too, who might be new listening to this show, this is not a Christian podcast. This is a podcast hosted by a Christian. And I think that, we bring all sorts of worldviews onto this show. We had Joe on today to give us a little sample of Christianity, because I think it's so misled, because I wanted to highlight your last point, which said so many Christians mess this up. There are so many Christians are flawed, just like every other person is flawed. We all have our mistakes. We all have our differences. We all have our issues. And I encourage you to not judge the Christian faith by the follower, but instead judge the Christian faith by the Christian, the Jesus Christ himself. What did he say? Go to the book. What did he say? Don't listen to the Christian, listen to the book. What did that book say? And I think that you'll start to find that there's nothing that man said that's quoted in a scripture that would do anything divisive other than to love people radically and to include people radically into his arms. All you got to do is believe his teachings. And I think that's the fantastic beauty of the Christian worldview.
Right. Yeah, absolutely, man. It's powerful stuff.
Well, I think we're closing in on our time. So I just wanted to close up here saying, guys, if you want to listen to this podcast, you can listen to it here, but we're also going to have aaronjarmstrong.com/podcasts. Joe, where can we find you real quick?
Well, I'm a pastor at Community Church in Oshkosh, so probably the best way is to find me there. Social media, Instagram, Joseph_Aronson.
What's up, everybody? This is your host, AJ Armstrong. You can follow me on Instagram at AaronArmstrong33.
That's Aaron Armstrong 33, or you can go to my website, aaronjarmstrong.com. Thanks so much for listening through to the end. I wanted to also introduce you guys to our Facebook community. So you can go to Winners Wallets Worldviews on Facebook, and it's a group where we can offer, different opportunities for you guys to ask questions. If you have a Q&A or something in your business or a challenge in your life that you want to bring up, that's the community to ask it. And then I can also share that with all of our listeners on our social media platforms. So with that said, guys, thanks so much for listening through to the end. Once again, go be somebody.